In 260 BC, the Roman Republic faced a mathematical impossibility. To secure control of Sicily and survive the First Punic War, a nation of dirt-bound heavy infantrymen had to destroy Carthage, the undisputed master of the Mediterranean Sea. The Senate did not solve this strategic deadlock by suddenly mastering the winds or producing a generation of superior sailors. They achieved victory through one of the most audacious acts of military theft in the ancient world. By capturing a single grounded enemy Quinquereme, Roman shipwrights executed a massive reverse engineering operation. They dismantled the vessel, copied its prefabricated technology, and built an instant armada of over 100 warships in merely 60 days. More importantly, they deployed a brutal, mechanical invention, a heavy wooden drawbridge equipped with a massive iron spike that allowed them to lock vessels together, effectively turning the rolling, unstable ocean into a static Roman infantry battlefield. Welcome back to World Chronicles. Today, we break down how Rome stole the sea from Carthage, examining the absolute logistical miracle of constructing their first fleet, the strict mechanics of the Corvus boarding bridge, and the tactical shock at the Battle of Mylae that permanently broke the myth of Carthaginian naval invincibility. When the conflict had erupted 4 years earlier in 264 BC, the Republic quickly discovered the severe limitations of its own military doctrine. The legions were an unstoppable force on the Italian peninsula, capable of crushing any opposing line through strict discipline and the relentless momentum of their heavy infantry formations. However, the new war centered on the island of Sicily, separated from the mainland by the treacherous waters of the Strait of Messina. Rome possessed no standing navy, no maritime tradition, and no seasoned admirals. To project power and sustain their troops on the island, the Romans had to cross a sea entirely dominated by the Carthaginian Empire. Carthage was the undisputed hegemon of the Western Mediterranean, possessing a fleet so vast and deeply entrenched that it effectively functioned as an impenetrable wooden wall across the water. The backbone of this maritime monopoly was the Carthaginian Quinquereme. It was not merely a troop transport, it was a highly specialized, lethal weapon of maneuver warfare. Propelled by the coordinated muscle of nearly 300 rowers, these vessels were designed to accelerate rapidly and strike with devastating precision. The primary Carthaginian tactic did not involve boarding or close-quarters combat. Instead, highly trained crews leveraged the kinetic mass of their ships, driving heavy, bronze-sheathed rams directly into the vulnerable timber hulls of enemy vessels. A single, well-placed strike would shatter the structure and drown an opposing crew before a Roman short sword could be drawn. For generations, Carthaginian captains had meticulously mastered the complex hydrodynamics and precise timing required to execute these lethal maneuvers on the open ocean. To the coastal allies of Rome, the approach of the enemy fleet was announced by the rhythmic, synchronized thud of thousands of heavy oars striking the water simultaneously. This sound heralded the arrival of absolute maritime blockades, severing vital supply routes and threatening expeditionary forces in Sicily with slow starvation. The Senate was paralyzed by a cold operational reality. Building a fleet from scratch, using outdated Roman ship designs, would merely provide Carthage with moving targets. The legions could not march on water, and they could not outmaneuver the greatest sailors of antiquity in a conventional naval war. Facing the imminent collapse of their campaign, the Roman military command reached an unprecedented conclusion. If they could not defeat the Carthaginians using traditional naval tactics, they would have to steal their enemies' deepest maritime secrets. The opportunity Rome desperately needed did not materialize from a brilliant strategic maneuver, but from a careless navigational error. In the early phases of the conflict, the Carthaginian navy operated with absolute impunity, frequently deploying squadrons to raid the Italian coast and observe Roman troop movements. During one of these aggressive scouting missions near the coastal region of Bruttium, a Carthaginian captain steered his Quinquereme too close to the unfamiliar, unforgiving shoals. The heavy warship ran aground, its keel digging firmly into the submerged sandbanks. Before the stranded crew could set fire to the hull and scuttle the vessel to protect its design, local Roman patrols overwhelmed them and seized the ship entirely intact. For the Senate, this captured vessel was not merely a trophy of war, it was the ultimate intelligence asset, delivered directly to their shores. The Republic immediately secured the stranded Quinquereme and turned it over to their best shipwrights, initiating a massive and meticulous reverse engineering operation. Roman engineers did not simply study the external profile of the warship, they systematically dismantled it, piece by piece, to understand the specific hydrodynamics, weight distribution, and internal bracing that made Carthaginian vessels so fast and lethal. Every bronze nail, every mortise and tenon joint, and the specific curvature of the ship's ribs were carefully measured and recorded. As the shipwrights stripped away the outer timber, they uncovered the true secret behind Carthage's overwhelming maritime dominance. It was not a reliance on superior materials, but a highly advanced system of mass production. Etched into the edges of the dismantled hull planks, Roman engineers discovered a sequential series of carved Punic letters and numbers. In an era where most Mediterranean shipbuilding relied heavily on the personal intuition and practiced eye of master craftsmen, Carthage had fundamentally industrialized the process. The Carthaginians were utilizing a standardized, prefabricated assembly system. Each piece of timber was cut to a uniform specification in the shipyards of North Africa, marked with a specific symbol, and then assembled like a massive mechanical puzzle. The carvings indicated exactly which plank locked into which frame, allowing even relatively unskilled laborers to rapidly piece together a complex warship. This was an absolute industrial revelation for the Romans. By copying these exact measurements and replicating the numbering system, the Republic realized they could entirely bypass decades of naval architectural trial and error. The Senate ordered their shipwrights to copy the enemy design plank for plank, standardizing the cutting of Italian timber based entirely on the stolen schematics. The response was an industrial mobilization that essentially transformed the Republic into a massive factory of war. Vast pine and fir forests of the Italian peninsula were systematically felled. Tens of thousands of laborers, carpenters, and idle legionaries were rapidly repurposed into a centralized maritime workforce. The coastal shipyards became a relentless hive of activity, driven entirely by the strict, militaristic discipline that governed Roman society. In an astonishing display of industrial capability, shipwrights applied the captured numbering system to the raw wood, turning chaotic construction sites into highly efficient, standardized assembly lines where each timber was slotted exactly into its pre-assigned place. The timeline dictated by the Senate defied every established principle of ancient maritime construction. From the moment the axes struck the first trees to the day the completed hulls slipped into the Mediterranean, only 60 days elapsed. Within this impossibly narrow window, an armada of 100 heavy Quinqueremes and 20 lighter triremes materialized from the Italian shipyard. However, this unprecedented speed carried a severe physical penalty. The timber used for the hulls was completely green and unseasoned, absorbing water rapidly and making the Roman vessels significantly heavier and far more sluggish than their sleek Carthaginian counterparts. Rome had acquired its fleet, but the ships themselves were fundamentally inferior in maneuverability. Furthermore, building a wooden hull is an engineering problem, operating a warship is a human one. A single Quinquereme required a crew of nearly 300 rowers working in absolute, rhythmic synchronicity to execute the complex acceleration and turning maneuvers demanded by naval combat. The Carthaginian Empire had spent generations perfecting this deep maritime coordination, while the Roman Republic possessed a grand total of 0 experienced sailors. To solve this critical human deficit, without wasting precious time on the open water, Roman commanders implemented a ruthlessly pragmatic training regimen directly on the Italian shoreline. While the shipwrights were still hammering the physical vessels together in the dry docks, military engineers constructed massive, tiered wooden scaffolding along the beaches. These static wooden benches perfectly mimicked the 5-banked seating arrangement inside the hull of a Quinquereme. Over 30,000 newly levied oarsmen took their places on these wooden skeletons on the sand. Day after day, they practiced the complex strokes required for naval propulsion. The sharp, concussive crack of the hortator's wooden mallet striking a block echoed continuously across the beaches, forcing the land-bound recruits to learn how to sweep, recover, and backwater in perfect unison without ever touching a drop of water. By the time the ships were finally launched, the rowers had successfully memorized the mechanical rhythm of the sea. Yet, the Roman military command operated with a cold, unforgiving pragmatism. They understood that even with 100 new hulls and 30,000 men drilled on the beaches, they could never match the hydrodynamic grace or the ramming expertise of a Carthaginian crew. In a war of maneuver, the heavier, green-timbered Roman ships would simply be outflanked and sunk. Therefore, the Senate concluded that they must completely abandon traditional naval doctrine. If Rome could not win a war on the water, they would force the sea to act as solid ground. To achieve this, Roman engineers designed a brutal mechanical countermeasure known as the Corvus, or the Raven. It was not a weapon of elegance, but one of raw, localized weight. The Corvus was a massive wooden drawbridge, measuring 36 feet in length and 4 feet in width, mounted vertically on a swiveling pillar near the prow of the Roman warship. At the top of the pillar, a complex rigging block held the bridge upright during transit. Affixed to the underside of the dropping end was a massive beak-like iron spike. When a Carthaginian vessel moved in for a ramming strike, Roman crews would release the ropes. The iron beak was designed to pierce straight through the enemy deck timber, using gravity to permanently lock the two moving vessels together. Once the bridge dropped, maritime mobility instantly ceased to matter. The articulated hinge allowed the Corvus to be rotated and deployed not just straight ahead, but to either side, intercepting flanking maneuvers. Across this narrow span, Rome could deploy its ultimate asset, the heavy infantry of the legions. Shield locked with shield, the legionaries could surge across the wooden planking and wage a close-quarters land battle over the rolling waves. The theory was mechanically sound, but a blueprint on land meant nothing until it absorbed the kinetic shock of actual combat. The true test of this bizarre mechanical contraption would arrive off the northern coast of Sicily against a veteran Carthaginian fleet that had never tasted defeat. In 260 BC, the newly minted Roman armada sailed into the waters off the promontory of Mylae. Under the command of Consul Gaius Duilius, the fleet of approximately 100 heavy warships moved with a slow, labored rhythm, burdened by their green timber and the untested coordination of their rowers. Waiting for them was the Carthaginian fleet commander, Hannibal Gisco, leading a superior force of 130 veteran warships. Hannibal was a seasoned admiral who possessed absolute confidence in the naval supremacy of his empire. When his lookout spotted the clumsy Roman formation lumbering across the horizon, the Carthaginian command staff did not perceive a legitimate strategic threat. They saw only an amateurish provocation, a desperate gamble by a land power that fundamentally misunderstood the geometry of naval warfare. To the Carthaginians, combat on the open ocean was an art form defined by speed, lateral movement, and the precise execution of flanking maneuvers. They viewed the heavy Roman vessels, complete with those bizarre mast-like pillars erected on their prows, with undisguised contempt. Believing the engagement would be a flawless rout rather than a contested battle, Hannibal Gisco made a critical command error. He did not bother to marshal his fleet into a synchronized, defensive battle line. Instead, he allowed his vanguard of 30 elite ships to surge ahead of the main formation, completely breaking ranks in an undisciplined race to claim the first prizes. The Carthaginian captains drove their rowers to maximum exertion, expecting the inexperienced Roman crews to panic and scatter at the sudden, violent approach of their bronze-sheathed rams. But the Roman fleet did not fracture. Aboard the command vessel, Consul Gaius Duilius maintained absolute tactical discipline, ordering his captains to hold their heading and row directly into the path of the oncoming Carthaginian vanguard. The Roman strategy relied entirely on neutralizing mobility by actively inviting the collision. On the decks, thousands of heavy legionaries stood in rigid formation, their scuta shields locked and their gladii ready, waiting for the brutal infantry engagement they had drilled for on the Italian beaches. Duilius offered the enemy commanders exactly what they desired, a straight, seemingly undefended target. As the sleek Carthaginian rams closed the final distance for the killing blow, expecting the clumsy Roman vessels to splinter under the impact, the Roman crews executed their single, practiced countermeasure. The heavy timber bridges, previously held vertical against the masts, were released in unison. The sharp, metallic groan of the pulley systems echoed across the decks just before the massive iron spikes plummeted downward, driven by sheer gravity, and punched violently through the wooden decking of the Carthaginian Quinqueremes. This was not a glancing blow. The iron beaks wedged deep into the structural framing of the enemy hulls, instantly and permanently tethering the highly maneuverable Punic warships to the heavier, static Roman vessels. The kinetic energy of the Carthaginian charge was completely absorbed and nullified by the mass of the locked ships. In a matter of seconds, decades of refined Carthaginian naval doctrine evaporated. The entire tactical foundation of the Punic fleet relied on maintaining continuous mobility, striking an enemy hull and immediately reversing oars to extract the ram before the damaged vessel could sink. Now, trapped by the iron grip of the Corvus, the Carthaginian rowers were entirely useless, their momentum violently arrested. Their superior speed, their intimate knowledge of coastal currents, and their flawless turning capabilities meant absolutely nothing when physically anchored to a heavier hull. The Roman engineers had successfully solved their greatest strategic deficit, transforming an unpredictable, fluid maritime engagement into a rigid, artificial landmass where wind and wave no longer dictated the victor. Across this sudden, static battlefield, Rome deployed its ultimate military asset. Upon the solid thud of the bridges locking into place, the Roman heavy infantry immediately surged forward. The Corvus was designed exactly 4 feet wide, a deliberate measurement that allowed 2 legionaries to cross side by side. Moving with the strict, mechanical discipline that had conquered the Italian peninsula, the infantrymen advanced with their curved shields locked together, forming an impenetrable wall of wood and iron that slowly pushed across the wooden span. They did not fight like desperate sailors caught in a chaotic boarding action. They fought exactly as they would on an open plain, relying on tight cohort formations and the lethal efficiency of the short gladius. The Carthaginian crews were entirely unprepared for this heavily armored onslaught. The men manning the decks of the Punic fleet were primarily light skirmishers and marines, personnel trained to throw javelins from a distance or repel minor boarding parties. They carried light wicker shields and short spears, gear completely inadequate for stopping a coordinated Roman infantry advance. The resulting engagement was a systematic, methodical clearing of the enemy decks. Stripped of their mobility and physically trapped within the confines of their own wooden rails, the Carthaginian sailors were steadily pushed backward and dismantled by the relentless forward pressure of the Roman shield wall. The battle ceased to be a contest of naval supremacy and was reduced to a brutal mathematical equation of close-quarters infantry combat, an equation the Roman Republic had spent centuries perfecting. 30 elite Carthaginian warships, the pride of the Mediterranean's greatest naval power, were captured in a shockingly brief window of time. The sheer mechanical efficiency of the Roman boarding action paralyzed the Punic command structure. As the entire 3-0 ship vanguard was systematically neutralized, the trailing elements of the Carthaginian fleet arrived at the engagement zone. Witnessing their leading vessels boarded and swarmed by legionaries, the remaining Punic captains did not immediately signal a general retreat. Instead, they relied on their deeply ingrained maritime superiority. Believing the static Roman bridges could only drop directly over the prow, they steered their highly maneuverable Quinqueremes in wide arcs, aiming to strike the broadsides and unprotected sterns of the Roman formation. The sharp crack of heavy oars, shifting rhythm, echoed across the water as the Carthaginian crews desperately executed these lateral maneuvers. This tactical assumption proved immediately fatal. The Roman shipwrights had anticipated flanking attacks and designed the Corvus with a swiveling base, allowing the entire mechanism to pivot. As the sleek Carthaginian ships swept alongside the Roman hulls to deliver their crippling side-ramming blows, the legionary crews simply rotated the wooden pillars and released the rigging. The heavy iron spikes crashed down laterally, locking the flanking vessels to the Roman broadsides. Once again, the momentum of the Carthaginian ships was violently arrested, and Roman heavy infantry poured across the spans to execute the same ruthless clearing operations. The ability of the Romans to project infantry power in a wide arc around their bows triggered a complete structural collapse of Carthaginian command and control. At the heart of the dying formation, the massive seven-banked septerine that served as the Carthaginian flagship was successfully grappled, boarded, and overrun by Roman soldiers. Recognizing that his vessel was lost and his supposedly invincible armada was being systematically dismantled by dirt-bound infantrymen, Fleet Commander Hannibal Gisco abandoned his post. Rather than going down with his flagship or attempting to rally his broken squadrons, he slipped over the side into a small, unarmored rowboat and fled the engagement to save his own life. Without leadership and entirely stripped of their tactical advantages, the surviving Carthaginian captains broke off their attack and scattered into the open sea. The numerical toll of the engagement was staggering. By the time the fighting ceased, Carthage had lost 50 warships to capture or destruction, including their supreme command vessel and thousands of veteran crewmen. It was an unprecedented disaster for the maritime empire. The aftermath of Mylae sent absolute shockwaves across the Mediterranean power structure. A landlocked republic had successfully stolen an empire's defining technological advantage, countered its tactical superiority with a crude mechanical innovation, and violently seized control of the open water. For this unprecedented operational success, Consul Gaius Duilius was awarded the first naval triumph in Roman history. To immortalize the achievement, the Senate commissioned the Columna Rostrata, a towering victory monument erected directly in the heart of the Roman Forum. Adorned with the heavy bronze rams sheared from the captured Carthaginian warships, the stone column stood as a permanent physical reminder that the sea was no longer an impassable barrier, but a new avenue for Roman expansion. The First Punic War would continue to violently grind on for more than 2 decades following Mylae, consuming hundreds of thousands of lives and plunging both states into profound financial exhaustion. The Corvus itself would eventually be abandoned by Roman military engineers, as the massive top weight of the wooden bridges made their Quinqueremes dangerously unstable in severe Mediterranean storms, contributing to catastrophic fleet losses later in the conflict. Yet, the tactical and psychological damage inflicted off the coast of Sicily was irreversible. The long-standing myth of Carthaginian maritime invincibility had been permanently shattered. Carthage was forced into a grueling war of naval attrition against an adversary that demonstrated a terrifying, industrialized capacity to rapidly replace lost ships and crews, fundamentally eroding the strategic monopoly of the North African Empire. Rome did not invent the heavy warship, nor did its citizens possess any inherent mastery of the ocean currents. Instead, the Senate relied entirely on the Republic's most defining cultural trait, a ruthless, unyielding pragmatism. By systematically reverse engineering an enemy's specialized design and forcibly adapting it to serve the lethal strengths of their own heavy infantry, the Republic transformed an impossible maritime disadvantage into the foundation of a global Mediterranean empire. Please subscribe to our channel to relive the great chapters of history together.